October 17, 1981, Knox County, Illinois. The night air was cold enough to sting, the kind of chill that clung to your lungs when you breathed. A thin mist drifted low across the fields, curling around the stalks of half-harvested corn like ghostly fingers. Out here, a mile from the nearest farmhouse, there was nothing but the wind and the whisper of dry leaves scraping against the cracked asphalt road. Deputy Frank O'Donnell's boots crunched against the gravel shoulder as he moved deeper into the dark. His flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, its narrow beam cutting through the fog. He had answered hundreds of late-night calls in his 10 years with the sheriff's department, but something about this one, a stalled car reported on Old Mill Road, made his stomach knot. When he reached the edge of the field, he stopped. There it was, a pale blue Chevy Nova, parked crooked just beyond the ditch, one door hanging slightly ajar. The headlights were still on, cutting pale tunnels through the mist. "Dispatch, I've got eyes on the vehicle," he said, pressing his radio to his mouth. "Plates match. No sign of the driver." A burst of static answered him, followed by the dispatcher's calm voice. "Copy that, 14. Proceed with caution." Frank's breath clouded in front of him as he stepped closer. The driver's door creaked when he touched it, swinging wider on its hinges. Inside, the Nova smelled faintly of stale perfume and gasoline. On the passenger seat lay a brown leather handbag, contents spilling out, lipstick, a Polaroid photo, a crumpled receipt from a local diner. But there was no wallet. No keys. No driver. Frank's throat tightened. He turned slowly, scanning the endless field around him. The mist seemed heavier now, muffling every sound, until even his own breathing felt too loud. Then, he heard it. A faint snapping sound, somewhere in the distance, like a twig breaking under weight. "Hello?" he called, his voice carrying into the emptiness. "Sheriff's Department." Silence. He walked toward the sound, pushing past tangled weeds until his boots sank into soft earth. That's when he saw it, a dark shape crumpled beneath a cluster of bare oak trees about 50 feet from the road. Frank froze, his chest heaving. "Dispatch," he swallowed hard. I think I've found something." As he moved closer, the beam of his flashlight swept over a woman's hand, pale against the wet leaves, fingers curled as if grasping for something unseen. Her clothes were torn, flecked with mud. Her shoes were missing. And there, just beside her, a thin silver chain lay snapped clean in two. Frank crouched down, reaching with trembling fingers to feel for a pulse he already knew he wouldn't find. "Dear God," he whispered. Behind him, the rustling of corn stalks rose with the wind, a soft, restless sound that carried like a whisper. Somewhere out there, whoever had left her here was walking free. The small farming community of Knox County would wake the next morning to whispers of a young woman gone, her life violently taken on a lonely stretch of road. And yet, despite the tireless efforts of investigators, the case would grow cold within months, buried beneath dead ends, conflicting stories, and secrets no one wanted to face. For 42 years, Laura Whitman's murder would haunt this town like a ghost, until a single, overlooked piece of evidence, discovered in a dusty box decades later, cracked the case wide open and pointed to someone no one ever suspected. Someone who had been right there, the entire time. The people of Knox County would remember Laura Whitman not for how she died, but for the light she carried in life. She was 21 years old, a college student with an easy laugh and big plans, the kind of person who managed to make even strangers feel like old friends. Born and raised in Galesburg, Laura grew up on the outskirts of town in a weathered two-story farmhouse, where Sunday dinners were sacred and neighbors were more like family. Her mother, Margaret Whitman, kept a framed photo of Laura on the mantel for decades. In it, Laura sits cross-legged in a field of wildflowers, hair pulled into a messy ponytail, grinning as if she's caught in the middle of a secret joke. That was her, Margaret would say years later. Always in motion. Always chasing something just out of reach. Dreams bigger than Knox County. Laura was the middle child of 3, and from a young age, she carried an almost restless energy, a sense that Knox County was too small to hold everything she wanted from life. She worked nights as a waitress at Miller's Diner, saving every dollar she could to pay her tuition at Carl Sandburg College, where she was majoring in education. She wanted to teach 2nd grade. Her best friend, Carrie Holt, remembers nights spent lying on the hood of Laura's car, staring at the stars above endless Illinois fields. She used to talk about moving to Chicago, Carrie recalled. Teaching kids by day, writing stories by night. She wanted to see the world, Paris, Rome, you name it. She had this list she kept folded in her wallet, 50 places she wanted to visit before she turned 30. She never made it past number 3. The little things people remember. Laura was a collector of moments, tiny, fleeting things that most people overlooked. She kept handwritten letters from everyone she loved, neatly bundled with twine in a showbox under her bed. She had an old Polaroid camera she carried everywhere, snapping photos of barns, roads, even strangers' dogs. She made mixed cassette tapes for her friends, carefully curating the order of each song, insisting that the transitions told a story. She'd get excited over the smallest things, her younger brother, Michael, said. Like, if she found a four-leaf clover, she'd make you stop whatever you were doing and look at it. She thought little things mattered. I think that's what people loved about her. The night everything changed. On the evening of October 16, 1981, Laura had just finished a late shift at Miller's Diner. It was unseasonably cold for October, the kind of night where breath hung heavy in the air. Carrie was supposed to meet her after work, but Laura called last minute to cancel. She said she was going to take care of something, and promised she'd explain later. Carrie didn't think much of it at the time, but years later, that phone call would haunt her. She sounded nervous, Carrie admitted in a 1992 interview. Not scared exactly, just distracted. Like her mind was somewhere else. By 11:30 p.m., Laura's car, the pale blue Chevy Nova she loved, was spotted near Old Mill Road, a desolate stretch bordered by thick woods and farmland. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. A town turned upside down. When news of Laura's death spread the next morning, Knox County froze. This was a place where people still left their doors unlocked, where kids played outside until dark, and everyone waved when they passed on the road. Murder didn't happen here, not to people like Laura. Local newspapers ran her story for weeks, front-page headlines in bold black ink. Young Galesburg woman found dead in field, investigation underway. People whispered at church services and grocery store lines. Parents kept their kids closer. Doors that had never seen locks suddenly had chains bolted overnight. The Whitman family retreated into themselves, overwhelmed by grief and relentless media attention. People think closure comes when they catch someone, Margaret Whitman said years later. But closure doesn't exist. You learn to live with the hole in your life. That's it. Foreshadowing the shadows. In the weeks leading up to her death, Laura had mentioned to Carrie, almost offhandedly, that she thought someone was following her. She joked about it, like, "Guess I've got a secret admirer," Carrie recalled. But sometimes she'd get real quiet after saying it, like maybe she didn't think it was funny. No one took her seriously at the time. Police files from the original investigation would later show Laura had received at least 3 anonymous phone calls in the weeks before she died. Each call lasted less than 30 seconds. No words were spoken, just silence. But in 1981, with limited technology and no clear leads, investigators had nowhere to go. Why her loss cut so deep? Laura wasn't just another name in a cold case file. She was the kind of person people expected to make it out, to escape the small-town limits she so often talked about. When her life was stolen, it wasn't just the Whitman family who suffered. It was her classmates, her co-workers, the kids she tutored on weekends. "We used to joke she'd be the one to get out of here," Carrie said through tears. She wanted more. And now, she never even got the chance. For 4 decades, Laura's absence left a lingering wound. The unanswered questions divided families, strained friendships, and turned neighbor against neighbor. The unseen thread. Somewhere in Laura's story lay the key to what happened that night. An overlooked letter. A broken bracelet. A name mentioned once and forgotten. For years, these fragments sat scattered in dusty boxes, waiting for someone to put them together. And when they finally did, 4 to 2 years later, the truth stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Because the person responsible for Laura's death wasn't a stranger. It was someone she knew. Someone the entire town trusted. Knox County, Illinois, October 14, 1981. The cornfields were quiet that morning. A pale gray mist hugged the ground, swallowing the edges of Knox County's narrow country roads. Dew clung stubbornly to the stalks, and the early autumn chill carried the faintest trace of damp earth and gasoline. At 6:12 a.m., Deputy Carl Whitman received a call over the crackling police radio. "Unit 4, we've got a report of an abandoned vehicle off County Route 7, near the old Miller farm. Caller says it's been there since last night." Over. Whitman, a seasoned deputy with 20 years on the force, wasn't expecting trouble. Abandoned cars weren't unusual, kids parked in secluded spots, locals broke down and walked home. But something about the dispatcher's tone, clipped, careful, made his stomach tighten. He turned onto the gravel shoulder, slowing his cruiser as his headlights cut through the fog. That's when he saw it. A powder blue 1977 Chevy Nova sat half hidden at the tree line, its driver's door cracked open like a half-forgotten secret. Whitman stepped out, boots crunching against wet gravel. The morning air was cold enough to bite, but sweat gathered at his neck beneath the weight of his badge. Something about the stillness didn't sit right. He approached the car cautiously, resting his palm on the handle of his holstered revolver. The interior told a story before he even touched anything. Debbie's purse lay on the passenger seat, unzipped, its contents spilled, lipstick, loose change, and a crushed pack of Marlboro Lights. Her brown leather wallet was still inside, cash untouched. A half-finished cup of diner coffee sat in the cup holder, cold and murky. Keys were still dangling from the ignition. No sign of Debbie. Whitman radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got Debbie Lewis's vehicle here. It looks abandoned. Purse is inside, keys still in. Get me back up and call the sheriff." Within minutes, the quiet gravel road transformed into a hive of flashing red and blue. Sheriff Tom Hardin arrived first, his weathered face set in grim determination. Hardin knew Debbie, everyone in Knox County did. She'd been a waitress at Frank's Diner for nearly 5 years. Hardin's wife had grown up next door to her family. In a town this small, there was no such thing as distance between lives. As investigators secured the perimeter, the scene began unfolding like a macabre puzzle. The ground told its own story. Just beyond the driver's side door, a single white sneaker lay half buried in the mud. It matched the pair Debbie's sister said she was wearing when she left for work the previous night. There were scuff marks on the gravel shoulder, signs of a struggle. Investigators crouched, brushing damp earth away, revealing 2 parallel drag marks leading deeper into the woods. Blood droplets, faint, nearly washed away by the night's mist, dotted the trail. By 8:45 a.m., the K9 unit arrived. The German Shepherd, Max, caught Debbie's scent from the driver's seat and bolted toward the trees. The search party followed, flashlights cutting through the thinning fog, boots sinking into soft earth. The discovery. Less than 300 yards into the woods, the barking stopped. Deputy Whitman was the first to see her. Debbie lay face down, her body partially covered by fallen leaves, as though the forest itself was trying to hide her. Her blonde hair fanned across the damp soil, streaked with dirt and blood. One of her hands was curled beneath her chest, the other stretched out, fingertips grazing the edge of a shallow creek. Her blouse was torn. There were ligature marks on her wrists, deep bruises along her jawline, and the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. Whitman swallowed hard, his throat tight, before muttering under his breath, "God, Debbie." Sheriff Hardin crouched beside her, pulling off his hat and bowing his head. He stayed silent for a long moment before standing and turning to his deputies. "Mark this entire area. Nobody steps past the tape without my say-so." Evidence that raised questions. Crime scene techs combed the area for hours. They found a torn piece of plaid fabric snagged on a tree branch, later identified as belonging to a men's flannel shirt. Cigarette butts scattered near the drag marks, none matching Debbie's Marlboro Lights. A crumpled Polaroid photo half buried in the mud, showing a blurry image of a red pickup truck. Investigators couldn't tell if it was related or just trash. Tire impressions from a vehicle that wasn't Debbie's Nova, heading back toward County Route 7. The deeper they dug, the less sense it made. The weight of the moment. By early afternoon, word had spread across Knox County. Locals gathered along the roadside, hushed and wide-eyed, as deputies tried to keep them back. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Old men stood silent, hats in hand. Frank Lewis, Debbie's father, arrived at the scene around 2 p.m. Sheriff Hardin intercepted him before he could get close. Frank's face was ashen, his lips trembling. "Tell me it ain't her, Tom." Hardin didn't speak, he didn't need to. The silence said everything. Frank collapsed against the hood of his truck, muffling a sob into his hands. That image, the heartbroken father, the lifeless woods behind yellow tape, the sheriff's stone-set jaw, would burn itself into Knox County as collective memory. A town transformed. That night, the Knox County Gazette ran a single, devastating headline. "Local woman found dead, foul play suspected." Fear settled over the small town like fog. Women stopped walking home alone. Locks were changed. Neighbors eyed one another with quiet suspicion. But for investigators, the terror was compounded by frustration. No clear suspect. No murder weapon. No eyewitnesses. Every lead seemed to dry up as quickly as it appeared. And yet, buried beneath the mud and blood at the crime scene was one overlooked piece of evidence, a detail no one would fully understand until 4 decades later, when a hidden letter would finally crack the case wide open. The Knox County Police department was small in 1981, just 8 officers and a sheriff, all accustomed to the usual rhythm of a quiet Midwestern town. A stolen bicycle. A noise complaint. The occasional bar fight. But a missing 23-year-old woman, and not just any woman, but Deborah Debbie Lewis, a beloved figure in town, was different. It was the kind of case that made even seasoned officers' stomachs tighten. The first 48 hours. Detective Raymond Ray Holloway, a grizzled investigator with 15 years on the force, was assigned lead. He arrived at Debbie's small one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town the morning after her disappearance was reported. First thing I noticed, Holloway would later tell reporters, was how normal everything looked. Too normal. There were no signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. Her purse still sat on the kitchen table, neatly zipped, with her wallet inside. The bed was made. But on the counter sat a half-finished cup of tea, cold to the touch, and next to it, an open notebook filled with handwritten letters. One was signed but unsent. It read, "I know what you did. You can't hide it forever." Holloway tucked that into an evidence bag, his instincts already whispering, this wasn't a simple disappearance. Witness statements. Detectives canvassed Knox County, starting with the Rusty Lantern, a popular diner where Debbie worked part-time. Her co-workers described her as sweet, dependable, and the kind of person who wouldn't just up and leave. Lydia Price, her closest friend, broke down during questioning. She was scared, Lydia sobbed. The last week, she kept saying someone was watching her. But when I asked who, she just changed the subject. Another potential lead came from Al Jennings, a retired mill worker who lived in Debbie's apartment building. He claimed he saw her the night she vanished, standing by a dark green Chevrolet Monte Carlo parked across the street, arguing with a man Al didn't recognize. I heard him say, "You promised to keep quiet." Then she yelled something back, but I couldn't make it out, Earl told investigators. Police searched for the Monte Carlo, but the lead went cold within days. The boyfriend alibi. Attention quickly turned to Mark Ellison, Debbie's on-again, off-again boyfriend. Mark, a 26-year-old auto mechanic, had a reputation around town for a short temper. When questioned, Mark admitted they'd argued earlier that week but insisted he was home drinking beer and watching a Reds game the night she disappeared. His alibi was shaky, no one could confirm it, but detectives lacked enough evidence to hold him. Years later, Holloway would confess. Something about Ellison didn't sit right. But back then, we had nothing, no body, no witnesses, no forensics. Just gut feelings. And gut feelings don't hold up in court. Mounting pressure. By the second week, the case dominated Knox County's local paper, the Daily Gazette. Headlines screamed. Missing woman, police stumped. Friends fear foul play in Lewis case. Community search parties combed wooded areas, rivers, and abandoned barns. Flyers with Debbie's smiling photo were stapled to every telephone pole in town. But behind the scenes, Holloway and his team were unraveling. Every lead collapsed into dust. Every interview ended in frustration. And then came the letter. The anonymous letter. 2 weeks after Debbie's disappearance, a handwritten letter arrived at the police station, postmarked Columbus, Illinois, about an hour away. It read, "If you want to know what happened to Debbie, ask Sarah." No last name. No return address. Just that single, chilling line. Detectives scoured Debbie's social circles for any Sarahs. They found 3. Sarah Whitman, a co-worker, had a rock-solid alibi. Sarah Green, a college friend, hadn't spoken to Debbie in over a year. Sarah Morris, a quiet, withdrawn woman who'd attended Debbie's church. When police reached out, Sarah Morris denied knowing Debbie well. But Holloway noted something peculiar in his report. During questioning, Morris's hands shook. Her answers were clipped. When asked about her whereabouts the night Debbie disappeared, she paused a long time before saying she was home. Still, there was no physical evidence tying Sarah to Debbie. She slipped through their fingers. Theories and rumors. By late summer of 1981, Knox County was drowning in theories. Theory 1, a lover's quarrel gone wrong. Many believed Mark Ellison killed Debbie in a jealous rage and hid her body. Theory 2, a stranger abduction. Others feared a drifter passing through town targeted her. Theory 3, small-town secrets. A few whispered that Debbie had uncovered something dark, maybe at the church where she volunteered. Even within the department, detectives were divided. The lack of a crime scene or a body left them paralyzed. The case goes cold. By early 1980, leads had dried up completely. Evidence sat gathering dust in cardboard boxes stacked in the Knox County PD basement. The unsent letter from Debbie's notebook. Eyewitness statements about the Monte Carlo. A list of possible Sarahs. Debbie's family held vigils every year, hoping for closure. Holloway retired in 1991, still haunted by the case. Every time I looked at her picture, he once said, I felt like she was asking me why I hadn't found her. Foreshadowing the breakthrough. What no one knew then was that the truth lay hidden in plain sight. One detail buried in those dusty evidence boxes, an overlooked handwritten note, would, decades later, shatter everything investigators thought they knew. But in 1981, the trail went cold, and Knox County was left with more questions than answers. Knox County, Illinois, October 14, 1981. The cornfields were quiet that morning. A pale gray mist hugged the ground, swallowing the edges of Knox County's narrow country roads. Dew clung stubbornly to the stalks, and the early autumn chill carried the faintest trace of damp earth and gasoline. At 6:12 a.m., Deputy Carl Whitman received a call over the crackling police radio. Unit 4, we've got a report of an abandoned vehicle off County Route 7, near the old Miller farm. Caller says it's been there since last night. Over. Whitman, a seasoned deputy with 20 years on the force, wasn't expecting trouble. Abandoned cars weren't unusual, kids parked in secluded spots, locals broke down and walked home. But something about the dispatcher's tone, clipped, careful, made his stomach tighten. He turned onto the gravel shoulder, slowing his cruiser as his headlights cut through the fog. That's when he saw it. A powder blue 1977 Chevy Nova sat half-hidden at the tree line, its driver's door cracked open like a half-forgotten secret. Whitman stepped out, boots crunching against wet gravel. The morning air was cold enough to bite, but sweat gathered at his neck beneath the weight of his badge. Something about the stillness didn't sit right. He approached the car cautiously, resting his palm on the handle of his holstered revolver. The interior told a story before he even touched anything. Debbie's purse lay on the passenger seat, unzipped, its contents spilled, lipstick, loose change, and a crushed pack of Marlboro Lights. Her brown leather wallet was still inside, cash untouched. A half-finished cup of diner coffee sat in the cup holder, cold and murky. Keys were still dangling from the ignition. No sign of Debbie. Whitman radioed in. Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got Debbie Lewis's vehicle here. It looks abandoned. Purse is inside, keys still in. Get me back up and call the sheriff. Within minutes, the quiet gravel road transformed into a hive of flashing red and blue. Sheriff Tom Hardin arrived first, his weathered face set in grim determination. Hardin knew Debbie, everyone in Knox County did. She'd been a waitress at Frank's Diner for nearly 5 years. Hardin's wife had grown up next door to her family. In a town this small, there was no such thing as distance between lives. As investigators secured the perimeter, the scene began unfolding like a macabre puzzle. The ground told its own story. Just beyond the driver's side door, a single white sneaker lay half buried in the mud. It matched the pair Debbie's sister said she was wearing when she left for work the previous night. There were scuff marks on the gravel shoulder, signs of a struggle. Investigators crouched, brushing damp earth away, revealing 2 parallel drag marks leading deeper into the woods. Blood droplets, faint, nearly washed away by the night's mist, dotted the trail. By 8:45 a.m., the K-9 unit arrived. The German Shepherd, Max, caught Debbie's scent from the driver's seat and bolted toward the trees. The search party followed, flashlights cutting through the thinning fog, boots sinking into soft earth. The discovery. Less than 300 yards into the woods, the barking stopped. Deputy Whitman was the first to see her. Debbie lay face down, her body partially covered by fallen leaves, as though the forest itself was trying to hide her. Her blonde hair fanned across the damp soil, streaked with dirt and blood. One of her hands was curled beneath her chest, the other stretched out, fingertips grazing the edge of a shallow creek. Her blouse was torn. There were ligature marks on her wrists, deep bruises along her jawline, and the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. Whitman swallowed hard, his throat tight, before muttering under his breath, "God, Debbie." Sheriff Hardin crouched beside her, pulling off his hat and bowing his head. He stayed silent for a long moment before standing and turning to his deputies. "Mark this entire area. Nobody steps past the tape without my say-so." Evidence that raised questions. Crime scene techs combed the area for hours. They found a torn piece of plaid fabric snagged on a tree branch, later identified as belonging to a men's flannel shirt. Cigarette butts scattered near the drag marks, none matching Debbie's Marlboro Lights. A crumpled Polaroid photo half buried in the mud, showing a blurry image of a red pickup truck. Investigators couldn't tell if it was related or just trash. Tire impressions from a vehicle that wasn't Debbie's Nova, heading back toward County Route 7. The deeper they dug, the less sense it made. The weight of the moment. By early afternoon, word had spread across Knox County. Locals gathered along the roadside, hushed and wide-eyed, as deputies tried to keep them back. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Old men stood silent, hats in hand. Frank Lewis, Debbie's father, arrived at the scene around 2 p.m. Sheriff Hardin intercepted him before he could get close. Frank's face was ashen, his lips trembling. "Tell me it ain't her, Tom." Hardin didn't speak, he didn't need to. The silence said everything. Frank collapsed against the hood of his truck, muffling a sob into his hands. That image, the heartbroken father, the lifeless woods behind yellow tape, the sheriff's stone-set jaw, would burn itself into Knox County as collective memory. A town transformed. That night, the Knox County Gazette ran a single, devastating headline. "Local woman found dead, foul play suspected." Fear settled over the small town like fog. Women stopped walking home alone. Locks were changed. Neighbors eyed one another with quiet suspicion. But for investigators, the terror was compounded by frustration. No clear suspect. No murder weapon. No eyewitnesses. Every lead seemed to dry up as quickly as it appeared. And yet, buried beneath the mud and blood at the crime scene was one overlooked piece of evidence, a detail no one would fully understand until 4 decades later, when a hidden letter would finally crack the case wide open. The Knox County Police Department was small in 1981, just 8 officers and a sheriff, all accustomed to the usual rhythm of a quiet Midwestern town. A stolen bicycle. A noise complaint. The occasional bar fight. But a missing 23-year-old woman, and not just any woman, but Deborah Debbie Lewis, a beloved figure in town, was different. It was the kind of case that made even seasoned officers' stomachs tighten. The first 48 hours. Detective Raymond Ray Holloway, a grizzled investigator with 15 years on the force, was assigned lead. He arrived at Debbie's small one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town the morning after her disappearance was reported. "First thing I noticed," Holloway would later tell reporters, "was how normal everything looked. Too normal. There were no signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. Her purse still sat on the kitchen table, neatly zipped, with her wallet inside. The bed was made. But on the counter sat a half-finished cup of tea, cold to the touch, and next to it, an open notebook filled with handwritten letters. One was signed but unsent. It read, 'I know what you did. You can't hide it forever.'" Holloway tucked that into an evidence bag, his instincts already whispering, this wasn't a simple disappearance. Witness statements. Detectives canvassed Knox County, starting with the Rusty Lantern, a popular diner where Debbie worked part-time. Her co-workers described her as sweet, dependable, and the kind of person who wouldn't just up and leave. Lydia Price, her closest friend, broke down during questioning. She was scared, Lydia sobbed. The last week, she kept saying someone was watching her. But when I asked who, she just changed the subject. Another potential lead came from L. Jennings, a retired mill worker who lived in Debbie's apartment building. He claimed he saw her the night she vanished, standing by a dark green Chevrolet Monte Carlo parked across the street, arguing with a man L didn't recognize. "I heard him say, 'You promised to keep quiet.' Then she yelled something back, but I couldn't make it out," Earl told investigators. Police searched for the Monte Carlo, but the lead went cold within days. The boyfriend alibi. Attention quickly turned to Mark Ellison, Debbie's on-again, off-again boyfriend. Mark, a 26-year-old auto mechanic, had a reputation around town for a short temper. When questioned, Mark admitted they'd argued earlier that week but insisted he was home drinking beer and watching a Reds game the night she disappeared. His alibi was shaky, no one could confirm it, but detectives lacked enough evidence to hold him. Years later, Holloway would confess. Something about Ellison didn't sit right. But back then, we had nothing, no body, no witnesses, no forensics. Just gut feelings. And gut feelings don't hold up in court. Mounting pressure. By the second week, the case dominated Knox County, as local paper, the Daily Gazette. Headlines screamed. Missing woman, police stumped. Friends fear foul play in Lewis case. Community search parties combed wooded areas, rivers, and abandoned barns. Flyers with Debbie's smiling photo were stapled to every telephone pole in town. But behind the scenes, Holloway and his team were unraveling. Every lead collapsed into dust. Every interview ended in frustration. And then came the letter. The anonymous letter. 2 weeks after Debbie's disappearance, a handwritten letter arrived at the police station, postmarked Columbus, Illinois, about an hour away. It read, "If you want to know what happened to Debbie, ask Sarah." No last name. No return address. Just that single, chilling line. Detectives scoured Debbie's social circles for any Sarahs. They found 3. Sarah Whitman, a co-worker, had a rock-solid alibi. Sarah Green, a college friend, hadn't spoken to Debbie in over a year. Sarah Morris, a quiet, withdrawn woman who'd attended Debbie's church. When police reached out, Sarah Morris denied knowing Debbie well. But Holloway noted something peculiar in his report. During questioning, Morris's hands shook. Her answers were clipped. When asked about her whereabouts the night Debbie disappeared, she paused a long time before saying she was home. Still, there was no physical evidence tying Sarah to Debbie. She slipped through their fingers. Theories and rumors. By late summer of 1981, Knox County was drowning in theories. Theory 1, a lover's quarrel gone wrong. Many believed Mark Ellison killed Debbie in a jealous rage and hid her body. Theory 2, a stranger abduction. Others feared a drifter passing through town targeted her. Theory 3, small-town secrets. A few whispered that Debbie had uncovered something dark, maybe at the church where she volunteered. Even within the department, detectives were divided. The lack of a crime scene or a body left them paralyzed. The case goes cold. By early 1980, leads had dried up completely. Evidence sat gathering dust in cardboard boxes stacked in the Knox County PD basement. The unsent letter from Debbie's notebook. Eyewitness statements about the Monte Carlo. A list of possible Sarahs. Debbie's family held vigils every year, hoping for closure. Holloway retired in 1991, still haunted by the case. "Every time I looked at her picture," he once said, "I felt like she was asking me why I hadn't found her." Foreshadowing the breakthrough. What no one knew then was that the truth lay hidden in plain sight. One detail buried in those dusty evidence boxes, an overlooked handwritten note, would, decades later, shatter everything investigators thought they knew. But in 1981, the trail went cold, and Knox County was left with more questions than answers. This phase explores how the case stalls, how leads dry up, and how the victims' loved ones, investigators, and community grapple with decades of uncertainty. It should be emotionally heavy, immersive, and build empathy while reinforcing the cold, haunting weight of time passing. Opening visual and emotional tone. We open in 1980, a year after Debbie's disappearance. The camera lingers on a dimly lit living room in Knox County, Illinois. A clock ticks loudly. Debbie's mother, Martha Lewis, sits on the couch holding a faded photograph of her daughter. The TV hums faintly, tuned to a news broadcast about another missing woman. Her face is blank, but her eyes are swollen and red. This scene sets the emotional weight of the case, and then we zoom out to the wider world, a family trapped in grief, an investigation stuck in limbo, and a community slowly forgetting. Section 1. The leads that went nowhere. Approx 500 to 600 words. 1. False witness sightings. Detectives chased every tip, every whispered rumor. A truck driver claimed to have seen Debbie at a rest stop off Route 33 3 days after she disappeared. Police rushed there, canvassed the area, but it was nothing, mistaken identity. Weeks later, a waitress swore she served Debbie at a diner in West Virginia, looking scared, with a man in a dark jacket. That lead collapsed when security footage revealed it wasn't her. Each dead end drained resources and frustrated detectives. Over time, the urgency began to fade. 2. The anonymous letters. In 1982, Knox County, PD received 2 anonymous letters. "You're looking in the wrong place. The river holds her secrets." Search teams dragged the Hocking River for days. Nothing surfaced. The letters were traced, cheap stationery, no fingerprints, no DNA. A cruel prank or a deliberate distraction? They never knew. 3. The person of interest that collapsed. For nearly a year, suspicion fell on Debbie's ex-boyfriend, Rick Stanton, a mechanic known for his temper. He was interrogated 3 times, his house searched twice, but his alibi held. He'd been working a double shift the night she vanished. Public opinion turned vicious. Rick eventually left town, unable to live under the weight of whispered accusations. Section 2. The toll on Debbie's family. Approx 500 to 600 words. 1. Martha and John Lewis. Debbie's parents handled their grief differently. Martha clung to hope, keeping Debbie's bedroom untouched, posters still on the wall, clothes folded in drawers. John, on the other hand, grew bitter and angry. He stopped attending church, stopped speaking to neighbors, stopped believing the police would ever find answers. Their marriage frayed under the strain. By 1985, they were sleeping in separate rooms, communicating only when necessary. 2. The siblings. Debbie's younger brother, Eddie, was just 16 when she disappeared. By his mid-20s, he admitted feeling invisible. Everyone cared about Debbie. Nobody saw me. I felt like I had to be the strong one, but inside, I hated her for leaving. I hated myself for thinking that. This humanizes the secondary victims, the families who live in limbo. 3. Birthdays and empty chairs. One particularly haunting moment. Every year, Martha baked Debbie's favorite chocolate cake on her birthday. One candle. Always lit. Always untouched. By the late 1990s, the cake tradition stopped. It had become too painful. Section 3. Detectives burn out. Approx 300 to 400 words. Detective Frank Delaney, who worked Debbie's case from the start, described it in a 2003 interview. You start every morning thinking, today's the day. Then months pass. Then years. And one morning, you stop believing. That's the part they don't warn you about, the day hope dies. Over the decades, 4 different lead detectives took over the file. Evidence degraded. Witnesses moved away or passed on. Institutional memory faded. By 2005, the case was officially marked cold. Section 4. The community moves on. But doesn't forget. Approx 200 to 300 words. At first, Knox County rallied around the Lewis family. Fundraisers, missing posters, prayer circles. But as years passed, posters were replaced by ads. Candlelight vigils dwindled. Neighbors stopped mentioning Debbie's name. But beneath the surface, fear lingered. Parents warned their daughters not to walk home alone. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. The Knox County vanishing became local folklore, a ghost story told to teenagers daring each other at night. The passage of time. Martha Lewis, now in her 70s, sits on her porch. A box of old clippings rests at her feet. She whispers, 40 years, and I still set a place for her at Christmas. 4 decades after Deborah Debbie Lewis's disappearance, the quiet town of Knox County, Illinois became a place where fact blurred with fiction. At first, people whispered. Then they speculated. Eventually, Debbie's story turned into something else entirely, a collection of ghost stories, cautionary tales, and whispered urban myths that children dared each other to repeat after dark. The haunting of Hollow Creek. Locals claimed that Hollow Creek Road, the last place Debbie was reportedly seen alive, became cursed after 1981. Teenagers told stories of headlights flashing on lonely nights, only to find no other car on the road. A local gas station clerk swore that in the early 1980s, a young woman matching Debbie's description appeared at his window one night, soaking wet, whispering, "Help me, he's coming," before vanishing into thin air. Older residents dismissed it as small-town hysteria, but the story spread anyway. By the mid-80s, Hollow Creek earned a nickname, the Vanishing Mile. Some said if you drove the stretch at midnight and honked 3 times, you'd see a young woman's silhouette in the woods. Others claimed you could hear distant screaming carried on the wind. The locked room rumor. In the early 90s, a rumor began circulating at Knox County High School. Students whispered that Debbie hadn't been kidnapped at all, she'd been kept alive, somewhere nearby, in a locked basement or attic. An entire generation of teenagers grew up daring each other to sneak into abandoned houses, convinced one of them might still hold Debbie captive. One boy, Eli Tripp Porter, now in his 40s, remembers breaking into an old farmhouse with his friends back in 1994. "We thought we'd found her room," Eli recalled decades later. "There was this bed with restraints tied to it, and a scratched name on the wall, Debbie. We ran like hell. I still don't know if it was real or just some sick prank." Detectives dismissed claims like these, they'd searched those houses countless times. But to the kids of Knox County, the locked room rumor became the legend that refused to die. The blue pickup sightings. Another theory emerged from scattered eyewitness accounts. Multiple residents claimed they'd seen a blue Ford pickup truck the night Debbie disappeared, idling near the edge of town. Some swore they saw a man matching her boyfriend's build behind the wheel. Others insisted it wasn't him at all, that the driver was older, someone not from around here. Over time, this blue truck became a symbol of fear. Parents warned their daughters, "Don't get in a car you don't know." Kids swore they'd seen it following them late at night. One man claimed the truck still roams the backroads of Knox County, every anniversary of her disappearance, always appearing and disappearing without a trace. The ghost in the library. By the late 90s, Knox County had become a town of haunted whispers. The Knox County Public Library, where Debbie used to work part-time, became the center of one particularly eerie legend. Employees reported hearing soft humming late at night, the melody of Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, Debbie's favorite song according to her sister. A custodian once claimed he found a single wet footprint leading into the archive room, but none leading out. Was it Debbie's ghost? Or just collective grief given shape? Family torment and the weight of myth. For the Lewis family, these stories were unbearable. Debbie's mother, Marianne Lewis, stopped attending town gatherings after the third year. She couldn't stand overhearing teenagers joking about seeing Debbie's ghost at Hollow Creek. They turned my daughter into a campfire story, she told a local reporter in 1987. To them, she's a thrill. To us, she's still missing. Her brother, Tommy, reacted differently, chasing down every rumor. If someone claimed to have seen Debbie, Tommy was there. If a rumor surfaced about a hidden room, Tommy would break in himself before the police even arrived. Every lead's the one that's gonna bring her home, he'd tell people. But each false hope cut him deeper. Conspiracy theories take root. By the 2000s, the internet breathed new life into old wounds. Online forums dedicated to missing persons cases latched onto Debbie's story, spinning elaborate theories. Some argued the local sheriff's department covered up evidence to protect someone powerful in town. Others believed Debbie was the victim of a serial predator connected to similar cases across Illinois. A few fringe believers swore the town itself was cursed, that every 20 years, a young woman disappeared into the woods. Most disturbingly, some claimed to have solved the case entirely, naming names and fueling bitter divides in Knox County. Neighbors turned on each other. Families stopped talking. Truth and fiction became indistinguishable. The legacy of fear. By the time 2023 rolled around, the year a hidden letter would finally break the case open, Debbie's story was more legend than reality. Teenagers who hadn't even been born in 1981 still whispered her name on late-night drives. Parents still warned their children to avoid Hollow Creek after dark. And somewhere, in the collective memory of Knox County, the girl who vanished had become both victim and ghost, trapped between truth and myth. What no one knew then was that the real story was far darker than any of the legends. And the truth, once revealed, would shatter everything the town thought it knew. After more than 4 decades of unanswered questions, heartbreak, and fading hope, the case of Deborah Debbie Lewis felt as though it had been permanently sealed in time. By 2022, the dusty boxes containing her files sat buried deep in the Knox County Police Department's archives, labeled inactive. To many in the small Illinois town, Debbie had become a name whispered only in passing, a tragic footnote in Knox County as history. But then, everything changed with a single, unexpected discovery. The day everything shifted. It was a bitterly cold morning in early March 2023 when Janice Harper, a recently retired schoolteacher, decided to finally clean out the attic of her late father's farmhouse on the outskirts of Knox County. The Harper family had lived there since the 70s, and the attic had become a time capsule, old furniture, yellowed newspapers, and boxes stacked like forgotten monuments to decades past. Janice almost didn't notice it at first, a small, warped box tucked behind an old cedar chest, covered in dust. Inside, wrapped in crumbling newspaper, was an envelope sealed with yellowing tape. On the front, in faded ink, it read, "To be opened only if something happens to me. Ch." Janice's father had been a close friend of a man named Calvin "Cal" Hensley, a well-known handyman around Knox County, back in the late 70s. Cal had died suddenly in 1985 in a logging accident, or so everyone believed. Janice hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated September 15, 1981. Her hands trembled as she read. "I don't know how long I can keep quiet about what I saw. I can't sleep. I can't eat. That girl, Debbie, she didn't just disappear. I know who took her. I saw him that night, by the old quarry. If anyone ever finds this, it was Robert E. Miller. Don't trust the sheriff. He knows too." Janice stared at the letter, stunned. Robert E. Miller had been a respected businessman in Knox County, in the 70s, owner of a local construction company, and, crucially, a close family friend of then-Sheriff Harold Jennings. This letter had the potential to blow the case wide open. The call that reignited the case. Janice brought the letter to Detective Laura Whitaker, who had been quietly obsessed with Debbie's case for years. Laura was only 10 years old when Debbie disappeared in 1981, and her older sister had been Debbie's classmate. To her, solving this case was personal. "I've waited my entire career for something like this," Laura later told reporters. She reopened the investigation, calling in the Illinois Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, for support. Within a week, the once-forgotten files were pulled from storage, and a new task force, dubbed Operation Quarry, was formed. The first breakthrough, DNA technology. One of the first things the task force did was re-examine the physical evidence collected from the original crime scene in 1981, Debbie's torn sweater, a set of hair strands, and a cigarette but found near the abandoned quarry. Back then, DNA testing didn't exist. But now, in 2023, cutting-edge touch DNA analysis could extract microscopic skin cells left behind decades ago. The results were shocking. The hair strands matched Debbie. The cigarette butt, long thought irrelevant, contained DNA belonging to Robert E. Miller. This was the first tangible link tying Miller to Debbie's disappearance. Interviewing the old guard. The next step was re-interviewing anyone still alive who had been connected to the case. Many had moved away, and some had died, but a few key names stood out. Margaret Lewis, Debbie's mother, now 83, living in assisted care. She broke down sobbing when Detective Whitaker told her about the letter. "I knew it," she whispered. "I always knew someone protected him." Sheriff Harold Jennings, now 92, frail but sharp-minded. When questioned about the letter's accusation that he covered up evidence, he refused to answer directly, saying only, "Some things were better left buried back then." Robert E. Miller's family, his widow and 2 adult sons, denied any involvement. But when confronted with the DNA evidence, their composure cracked. One son finally admitted, "Dad was out late that night, we never knew why." The town reacts. The revelation tore through Knox County, like a wildfire. The town's Facebook groups exploded with speculation. Old rumors resurfaced. People who had stayed silent for decades suddenly began sharing strange sightings and half-forgotten memories. A retired waitress recalled Miller showing up at her diner covered in mud the morning after Debbie disappeared. A former classmate remembered Debbie complaining about creepy stares from a friend of the sheriff. An old construction worker claimed Miller paid him to dump something at the quarry weeks later. For Knox County, the reopening of Debbie's case felt like reopening an old wound, but it also stirred a collective hunger for justice. Confronting the Miller legacy. By summer 2023, the evidence against Robert Miller had grown overwhelming. Though he had died of natural causes in 2001, prosecutors announced they would pursue an official posthumous indictment, a rare legal move meant to provide closure for Debbie's family and the community. At the press conference, Detective Whitaker stood beside Margaret Lewis, holding her hand. "This isn't about revenge," Laura said. "This is about the truth. Debbie deserves her story to be told." But one question remains. Despite the breakthroughs, the letter's warning still haunted investigators. Don't trust the sheriff. He knows too. Why had Sheriff Jennings, a man sworn to uphold the law, allegedly protected Robert Miller? When pressed, Jennings finally broke his silence in a recorded interview. "There were things about Robert, things you don't understand. He had friends in Columbus. People who funded half this county. If I'd pushed too hard back then, my family wouldn't have been safe." This revelation hinted at a larger cover-up, one possibly involving organized crime, local politics, and a network of powerful men willing to bury a young woman's life to protect one of their own. And so, while the Catalyst letter solved part of the mystery, it also opened a door to deeper secrets buried beneath Knox County as quiet streets. Ending beat. The Catalyst event wasn't just about discovering who likely killed Debbie Lewis, it shattered a decades-old silence and forced a small town to confront its past. But as Detective Whitaker stared at the letter late one night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was still keeping another secret. And if history had taught her anything, it was this. The deeper you dig in Knox County, the darker it gets. The weight of forgotten files. It was February 2023 when the Knox County Police Department's cold case unit received an unassuming brown box from an anonymous sender. Inside were photocopied pages of what appeared to be a handwritten letter, dated March 5, 1981, 2 years after Debbie Lewis vanished. The letter contained phrases so chilling that even seasoned detectives stopped in their tracks. "I told her she shouldn't have been there that night, she wouldn't listen. I didn't mean for it to happen. I buried her where the pines split, by the old creek bed." There was no signature. The handwriting analysis team compared the note against hundreds of samples collected back in the late 1970s and 80s. Within days, a match surfaced. Frank Bowers, one of the original suspects who had been interviewed in 1981 and cleared due to lack of evidence. Frank, now in his 70s, still lived in Knox County, only 2 miles from where Debbie was last seen. Detective Marissa Kane, head of the Cold Case Division, stared at the letter beneath the sterile glow of the evidence room light. She whispered to herself, 44 years, and has been right here. A case reborn. The department assembled a new task force, codenamed Pine Split, after the location mentioned in the letter. For many on the team, the Debbie Lewis case had been a ghost story told by older officers, a reminder that justice sometimes slipped away. But now, they had something tangible. Detective Kane personally reached out to Debbie's younger brother, Mark Lewis, now a 62-year-old grandfather living in Columbus. The phone call was brief, but heavy with unspoken emotion. "Mark, it's about your sister. We have a lead. We're reopening the case." Mark sat in silence, gripping the phone until his knuckles whitened. 4 years, he had begged investigators to look again, to dig deeper, but he had given up hope long ago. "I thought everyone forgot about her," he finally said, his voice breaking. "Not everyone," Kane replied softly. New technology, old evidence. In 1981, forensic science was primitive. Blood typing existed, but DNA profiling was still nearly a decade away. Now, with advanced tools, the task force re-examined every shred of preserved evidence from Debbie's case. From the archives, they pulled Debbie's last known outfit, carefully sealed in a deteriorating paper bag. A cigarette butt found near the edge of the creek bed, long ignored. Fibers collected from the backseat of Frank Bowers' truck during the original investigation. Samples were sent to the Illinois Bureau of Criminal Investigation for modern DNA testing. Detectives knew it could take weeks, maybe months, but this was their best chance. Interviewing the ghosts of the past. Detective Kane and her partner, Officer Luke Ramirez, began re-interviewing key witnesses. 44 years had blurred memories, but in a small town like Knox County, some scars never faded. They started with Frank Bowers. Frank lived in a crumbling farmhouse on the outskirts of town, overgrown weeds climbing up the chipped siding. When Kane and Ramirez knocked, he answered slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. "Frank Bowers?" Kane asked, holding up her badge. "Yeah, what's this about?" "Debbie Lewis," Ramirez said evenly. Frank's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he regained his composure. "That again? Jesus Christ. I told you people everything I knew back then. I didn't touch that girl." But Kane noticed something subtle. Frank's right hand trembled when she mentioned the creek bed. An uneasy town. News of the reopened investigation spread quickly. Knox County, a town where gossip traveled faster than light, became a pressure cooker of speculation. Some were relieved. Finally, maybe Debbie's family gets answers. Others were defensive. Frank's an old man now. Leave him be. And a few were afraid. Dredging up the past risked exposing old secrets people would rather stay buried. At the local diner, whispers filled the air. "You think Frank did it?" "I heard it was someone else. Somebody big in town back then." What if this letter was planted to frame him? The Pine Split search. Following the lead in the mysterious letter, the task force organized a forensic search near the old creek bed in the Pine Split area, a stretch of forest long avoided by locals. Ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs were brought in. After days of combing through thick underbrush and digging through the soft earth, investigators uncovered something chilling. A fragment of bone. The medical examiner later confirmed it belonged to a young woman in her early 20s, consistent with Debbie's profile. It wasn't full confirmation yet, but the task force believed they had finally found where she died. A startling discovery. While combing through the archived interview tapes, Officer Ramirez uncovered a never-before-transcribed recording from October 1981. In it, an elderly witness named Edith Holloway claimed she saw Debbie arguing with a man outside Miller's gas station on the night she disappeared. "I told the sheriff back then," Edith rasped on the tape. "I saw that poor girl shouting at someone by his truck. I don't know his name, but it wasn't Frank. Tall fella. Wore a brown work jacket. Had a scar on his cheek." This single statement contradicted the original timeline investigators had built around Frank Bowers. Had the wrong man been suspected all along? DNA breakthrough. 2 months into the reopened investigation, the Illinois BCI finally returned results. The cigarette butt found near the creek bed did not belong to Frank Bowers. It belonged to Richard "Rick" Calloway, a former construction worker, now deceased, who had worked with Debbie's father in 1981. DNA from fibers in Bauer's truck? No match to Debbie at all. This discovery blew the case wide open. Frank Bowers wasn't exonerated officially, but suddenly, the trail that had always led to him was crumbling. And yet, the letter, written in handwriting matching Frank's, still tied him to the burial site. A puzzling web of lies. Detective Kane now faced a grim possibility. If Frank didn't kill Debbie, why would his handwriting appear on a confession letter? If Rick Calloway's DNA was at the scene, why was his name never in the original files? And most troubling of all, who wanted Debbie Lewis gone badly enough to manipulate an investigation for 44 years? What started as a reopened cold case was morphing into something far more sinister, a cover-up rooted deep within Knox County as history. On a rainy April night, Detective Kane sat in her car outside Frank Bowers' farmhouse, watching through fogged glass. Inside, Frank was pacing, angry, restless. He picked up his phone and made a single call. Ramirez, monitoring from the van, patched into the wiretap. "You shouldn't have sent that letter," Frank hissed into the receiver. Silence. "I told you, I'm not taking the fall for this." Kane and Ramirez locked eyes. There was someone else involved, someone still alive, still dangerous. And for the first time in decades, the Lewis case wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about surviving the truth. The last few months had transformed Knox County, from a town haunted by a cold case into a buzzing hive of whispers and nervous energy. For 44 years, Debbie Lewis's disappearance had been the unsolvable riddle everyone had quietly learned to live with. But now, the silence had cracked. The catalyst was a single letter, yellowed by time, discovered in the attic of an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town. It bore Debbie's name, and an ominous message scrawled in handwriting that investigators immediately flagged as significant. For Detective Marla Jennings, who had taken over the cold case division just 3 years prior, the letter wasn't just evidence, it was a key. "Look at the way he writes the D," she said, pointing at the jagged strokes under the fluorescent lights of the lab. "It's rushed, defensive. Whoever wrote this wasn't just panicking, they were trying to hide something." Cross-referencing the handwriting with records from the late 70s, analysts identified similarities with a name that had surfaced repeatedly in early witness statements: Carl Whitman. Carl had been 23 in 1981, a quiet, introverted mechanic who lived 2 streets over from Debbie's family home. At the time, police had questioned him briefly, but his alibi, corroborated by his employer, cleared him. The case moved on, but Carl never quite left the periphery. A shadow that never left. When detectives pulled Carl's file, the edges were worn and stained, evidence of how many times someone had rifled through it over the decades. Carl, now 68 years old, lived alone in a weathered trailer on the outskirts of town. He'd never married. No kids. Worked odd jobs until retiring early due to back issues. Jennings stared at his faded DMV photo. "You ever notice how these guys never leave?" she murmured to her partner, Detective Ron Yates. "Why would they?" Yates shrugged. "Knox County, as the perfect hiding spot if no one's looking too hard." Surveillance began quietly. 2 unmarked cars rotated shifts outside Carl's trailer. He stuck to a predictable routine: early morning coffee runs, afternoons in his garage tinkering with scrap engines, evenings nursing a 6-pack on his porch. But then came something strange. Carl had recently burned several boxes of old papers in a backyard fire pit. "That's not nostalgia," Jennings noted grimly. "That's erasure. The DNA breakthrough." While Carl's life was being observed in real time, the forensics team was racing against history. The letter had yielded a faint partial print, too degraded for use in the 80s, but now, with next-gen DNA recovery, there was hope. After weeks of lab work, the results came in, a familial match. Not directly to Carl, but to his younger brother, Tom Whitman. Jennings's heart pounded as the pieces began to align. In 1981, Tom had been just 16 years old, quiet, awkward, always following Carl around like a shadow. His name had barely registered in the original investigation. "This changes everything," Jennings said, sliding the report across the table. Yates frowned. "So Carl's been protecting him, all this time." Reconstructing 1981. Detectives dove back into the timeline of Debbie's last known hours, this time focusing on the Whitman brothers. July 13, 1981. Debbie was last seen leaving her friend's house around 9:30 p.m. 9:45 p.m. A neighbor reported seeing a rust-colored Chevy Nova idling near Debbie's street. 10:15 p.m. A scream was heard behind the Miller barn, but no one investigated. July 14, 1981. Carl clocked in for his Saturday shift at Granger's Auto Shop at 7 a.m. sharp, giving him a near-perfect alibi. But newly uncovered payroll records revealed something chilling. Carl hadn't worked on the 14th after all. Someone else had clocked him in. That someone was Tom Whitman. Jennings could barely breathe as she pieced it together. He set up his own alibi, she whispered. He planned it. The interrogation that never happened. Armed with this, Jennings and Yates brought Carl in under the guise of routine questioning. In the small, windowless room at the Knox County Sheriff's Office, Carl sat hunched, his weathered hands folded tightly on the table. Jennings leaned forward. "Carl, we found the letter." A flicker, barely perceptible, crossed his face. "We also know Tom clocked you in that morning. So, here's the thing, you've been living with this a long time. I need you to tell me what happened to Debbie." Carl's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Jennings studied him in silence, letting the weight of the evidence hang in the room. Finally, Carl whispered, "Tom was just a kid. He didn't mean for it to happen." Following the trail. With that half-confession, investigators obtained a warrant to search Carl's property. Beneath decades of dust in his garage, they uncovered Debbie's missing necklace, a silver pendant engraved with her initials. Inside an old toolbox was an even darker find, Polaroids. Faded, grainy, but unmistakably showing Debbie the night she vanished. The photos placed Debbie inside Carl's trailer in 1981. Tracking Tom. Tom Whitman, now 61, had moved 3 states away and built an unremarkable life as a retired electrician. Detectives coordinated with out-of-state authorities to bring him in quietly. When Tom walked into the interview room, his eyes darted around like a trapped animal. Jennings laid out the Polaroids. "Tom, we know you were there. We know she was in Carl's trailer. You need to tell us what happened that night." Tears welled in his eyes. I just wanted to talk to her," he stammered. "Carl said she was, leading guys on. We just wanted to scare her." Jennings's voice was steady but firm. "Tom, Debbie never came home. Scaring her doesn't end with someone vanishing for 44 years. Tom broke down completely. "She hit her head. We panicked. Carl said nobody would believe us. We buried her." The recovery. On a gray, windswept morning in early 2023, deputies and forensic teams gathered in a field behind the Miller barn, the same spot neighbors had heard the scream decades earlier. 3 feet beneath the soil, they uncovered Debbie's remains. For the Lewis family, the discovery brought answers, but not peace. Debbie's younger sister, now in her 60s, stood by the taped perimeter, tears streaming down her face. "We begged them to look there back then," she whispered bitterly. Closing the net. Carl and Tom Whitman were arrested on charges of manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. As news spread through Knox County, residents gathered in stunned clusters outside diners and gas stations, revisiting every whispered rumor, every what-if, every missed clue. For Detective Jennings, there was no celebration. "We didn't solve this," she told a reporter. "The truth was always there. We just finally stopped looking in the wrong places." The arrests may have brought closure to the case, but the ripples had only begun. The town of Knox County, the Lewis family, and even law enforcement would soon reckon with a larger question. How could so many people miss the truth for so long? The house on Maplewood Lane looked quiet from the outside, its paint peeling beneath decades of neglect, its windows dark and expressionless like the eyes of something that had seen too much. For 44 years, the name Raymond Ray Hargrove had floated through whispers and half-truths, tucked away in dusty case files and fading memories. But tonight, the silence around his name was about to be broken. It was 5:43 a.m. on a brisk November morning when the unmarked SUVs rolled down the cracked pavement, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist. Inside the lead vehicle, Detective Laura Mitchell sat motionless, her hands wrapped tightly around a thermos of lukewarm coffee. She'd spent nearly 2 years rebuilding this case from fragments, old witness statements, forgotten lab reports, handwritten notes stuffed into unmarked envelopes. Every breadcrumb had led here. "This is it," murmured Agent Thomas Riley, her partner on the cold case task force, as he checked the chamber of his Glock. "No turning back after today." Mitchell didn't answer. Her gaze lingered on the house. "This is for Debbie," she thought. The raid. At 5:57 a.m., with dawn bleeding pale orange over Knox County, the command was given. Go. 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 Boots pounded against wet pavement. The front door splintered beneath the battering ram, wood cracking like a gunshot. Shouts filled the air, "Sheriff's Department. Hands where we can see them." Followed by the heavy, staccato rhythm of adrenaline. Inside, The house smelled of stale cigarettes and mildew. A television played softly in the corner, frozen on a rerun from the 80s. From the hallway, a figure stumbled out, disheveled, gray-haired, wearing a stained t-shirt and sweatpants. Raymond Hargrove blinked against the blinding flashlights, his face slack with confusion. "What the hell is this?" he barked, hands instinctively raised but fists still clenched. "Raymond Hargrove," Mitchell said firmly, stepping forward, "you're under arrest for the abduction and murder of Deborah Debbie Lewis, Knox County, Illinois, October 12, 1981. For a moment, the only sound was the clicking of handcuffs locking into place. Ray's face paled. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Shockwaves through the town. By sunrise, word had spread. Knox County, once haunted by its cold case, buzzed with stunned disbelief. Local radio hosts spoke in hushed tones. After 44 years, authorities have finally made an arrest in the disappearance of Deborah Lewis. Outside the sheriff's office, reporters crowded behind barricades, microphones raised, their breath puffing white in the cold. I don't know what to say," murmured Karen Lewis, Debbie's younger sister, standing at the gate clutching an old photograph. "We waited so long for this day, but I can't stop shaking. I keep wondering what else we'll find out." For the Lewis family, justice was finally within reach, but answers came at a price. The first interrogation. That afternoon, inside a sterile gray interview room at the Knox County Sheriff's Department, Raymond Hargrove sat slouched in a metal chair, wrists cuffed to the table. The years had not been kind to him. His once broad shoulders sagged beneath a faded flannel shirt, his skin weathered and lined from decades of drinking. Across from him sat Detective Mitchell and Agent Riley. A small recorder clicked softly on the table between them. "You know why you're here, Ray," Mitchell began, her voice low but steady. Ray stared at her, unblinking. "I didn't kill nobody," he muttered. "Then explain this," Riley said, sliding a faded photograph across the table. "Debbie Lewis, smiling under the autumn sun, taken the week before she disappeared. You were seen with her the night she vanished. Witnesses place your truck outside the Knox County diner at 11:47 p.m. Ray snorted. "I gave her a ride home, that's all." Knox County was small back then. Everyone knew everyone. Mitchell leaned forward. "We found something else, Ray." She laid out an evidence bag containing a single gold locket, tarnished but intact. "It was in your crawl space." Ray's breath caught, a subtle flinch, but Mitchell saw it. "You think you've been smart all these years," she said softly, "but the truth always surfaces. Cracks in the armor." Over hours of questioning, Ray's story shifted like sand beneath a tide. First, he denied knowing Debbie at all. Then he admitted giving her a ride but claimed she got out near the highway. By the third round, he said they'd hung out a little but that she took off with some guy. Mitchell remained silent, letting the inconsistencies pile up like bricks in a wall around him. Finally, she pulled out a final piece of evidence, a handwritten letter, discovered just months earlier, sealed inside a dusty box from the original investigation. It was written by Debbie herself. The letter, dated October 11, 1981, the night before she vanished, read, "Karen, if anything happens to me, promise me you'll tell Mom about Ray. He's been following me again. He won't take no for an answer." Ray froze. His hands trembled. For the first time, his eyes darted nervously around the room. You don't understand," he whispered. "Then help us," Mitchell said gently. "Tell us what happened." The breaking point. By 10:32 p.m., after nearly 9 hours in the box, Raymond Hargrove broke. His voice cracked, raw and uneven. "I didn't mean to hurt her." The words hung in the air like smoke. "She wanted to leave," he continued, tears welling in his bloodshot eyes. "She said she was going to tell her dad what I did. I just wanted to talk. She started screaming, hitting me. I grabbed her, and then..." He buried his face in his hands. "I panicked," he whispered. "I buried her out by Miller's Creek, behind the old sawmill. Nobody was supposed to find her." Mitchell closed her eyes, the weight of his words crashing down like thunder. For 44 years, the Lewis family had lived without knowing, without closure. Now they knew. Aftermath. Search teams were dispatched to Miller's Creek the next morning. Beneath decades of overgrowth, they uncovered Debbie's remains exactly where Ray said they would be. DNA tests confirmed the identity within days. The confession was airtight, but the pain was still raw. At a press conference, Karen Lewis stood before the cameras, clutching her sister's recovered locket in her hand. "This doesn't bring her back," she said softly, tears streaking her cheeks. But at least we finally know. Debbie can rest now. Final reflection. For Detective Laura Mitchell, the case's end was bittersweet. Standing beneath the fading autumn sky, she revisited the old diner where Debbie was last seen alive. The neon sign flickered faintly, paint chipped and forgotten, like the memory of a town that had buried too many secrets. Sometimes justice takes a lifetime, Mitchell said quietly, but it's still justice. Raymond Hargrove would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The Lewis family would finally bury Debbie properly. And Knox County, Illinois, could finally close a chapter it had carried like a scar for nearly half a century. The courthouse in Athens County, Illinois, was a gray block of history and judgment, its old stone walls carrying echoes of generations of justice served and miscarried. But on this day, 44 years after Deborah Debbie Lewis vanished, those walls seemed to hum with a weight unlike any other. Every seat in the gallery was taken. Locals who had lived through the whispers and rumors of 1981 leaned forward in silent anticipation. For the Lewis family, those who had survived the decades of grief, this moment was something between vindication and agony. At the front of the courtroom, Prosecutor Linda Watkins stood at the lectern, her voice steady, yet underscored with fire. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, 44 years ago, a young woman with dreams, a family, and a future disappeared. Her case grew cold. Her name faded from headlines. But she never stopped mattering. And today, we finally have the evidence to prove who took Debbie from this world. She gestured toward the defense table, where Richard "Rick" Callahan, now 68 years old, sat hunched and pale, his thinning gray hair slicked back, his weathered face betraying nothing. Callahan had once been Knox County's golden boy, a promising high school athlete turned respected local contractor. 4 decades, he had lived in plain sight, raising a family, attending church, even volunteering at community events. Nobody had ever imagined he was living a double life, hiding a monstrous secret. But the hidden letter found in the attic of Debbie's childhood home changed everything. Inside, a torn page from her diary revealed a name she feared, along with references to threats, unwanted advances, and a confrontation she planned to have the night she disappeared. The trial begins. The prosecution's case rested on a meticulous reconstruction of the night Debbie vanished. Forensic breakthroughs, advanced DNA techniques had finally extracted a viable profile from evidence found beneath Debbie's fingernails, matching Callahan. The letter, Debbie's diary entry, placed her in direct conflict with Callahan days before her death. Witnesses, former classmates testified about Callahan's obsessive interest in Debbie, his temper, and a chilling incident where he'd cornered her behind the local diner weeks before she disappeared. Defense attorney Gregory Shields argued back with calm precision, leaning heavily on the passage of time. 44 years, he said, turning to the jury. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Context is lost. My client is an old man now, a husband, a father, a grandfather. Are we really prepared to destroy his life based on a letter written by a scared teenager and degraded DNA fragments from the Carter administration? The courtroom split into 2 camps, those who still clung to Callahan's carefully cultivated image of decency, and those who had waited decades to see his facade crumble. Debbie's sister takes the stand. When Karen Lewis, Debbie's younger sister, took the stand, the entire courtroom fell into a hush. At 62, she carried herself with quiet dignity, though her voice trembled as she began. "Debbie was my best friend," she said softly. "She was the one who helped me pick out my prom dress, who covered for me when I missed curfew. She loved this town, and she trusted people. Including him." She looked at Callahan then, her gaze unflinching. "For 44 years, we've carried this weight. Holidays came and went. Mom and Dad died without knowing what happened. And he sat there, year after year, like he hadn't destroyed us." Her words pierced the jury like glass. One member dabbed tears from her eyes. Another stared at Callahan, expression unreadable. The breaking point. The trial's turning point came on the 6th day. Prosecutors introduced newly analyzed soil samples taken from Callahan's property decades earlier. Advanced technology revealed trace amounts of fibers matching Debbie's clothing buried beneath an old tool shed. The defense fought hard to suppress the evidence, arguing contamination, but Judge Margaret Fulton ruled it admissible. Callahan, up until then composed, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And then came the jailhouse informant, a man who'd briefly shared a cell with Callahan during his pretrial detention. He testified that Callahan had admitted things got out of hand that night, that she wouldn't stop screaming, and that he'd made sure nobody would ever find her. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Verdict. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The forewoman's voice cracked slightly as she spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Callahan, guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Karen clutched her brother's hand, tears streaming down her face. Callahan sat motionless, his expression finally breaking, a slight twitch in his jaw, a flash of anger buried beneath resignation. Aftermath. Outside the courthouse, the Lewis family stood before cameras and microphones, the flashing lights of news crews bathing their faces in cold blue and white. Karen spoke on behalf of the family. "Justice took 4 to 4 years. We never thought this day would come. But this isn't closure, there's no such thing when you lose someone you love. What we have now is truth. And Debbie finally has a voice again." Within weeks, Callahan was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the community of Knox County, the trial reopened old wounds but also brought a strange kind of reckoning. Urban legends faded. Rumors quieted. And for the first time in decades, people spoke Debbie's name without hesitation. At the old Lewis family home, Karen placed a framed photo of Debbie back on the mantel, the same photo she had hidden for years because it hurt too much to look at. "You're not just a ghost anymore," she whispered. "They finally heard you." Epilogue. Months later, a small plaque was installed near the wooded trail where Debbie's remains were discovered. "In loving memory of Deborah Debbie Lewis. 1956 to 1981. Gone but never forgotten." Every spring, wildflowers bloomed there now, tended by volunteers who never even knew her. The silence of those woods, once haunted by unanswered questions, now carries a quiet peace. For 44 years, Knox County had lived under a shadow. Now, at last, the light broke through. The courthouse steps were silent now. Where hundreds had once gathered, reporters thrusting microphones, camera shutters firing, protesters holding signs, the space was empty, save for a faint breeze carrying autumn leaves across the stone. Knox County, Illinois, had been through a storm. For over 4 decades, the disappearance of Deborah Debbie Lewis haunted this small town, weaving itself into its history like a scar that never fully healed. Now, with the trial concluded and justice finally delivered, there was a sense of closure, but also a reckoning. A family forever changed. Debbie's younger sister, Marlene Lewis, stood at the edge of her front porch, staring across the quiet street where children played, their laughter echoing faintly. She clutched a worn Polaroid of Debbie, its edges curled from decades of handling. "We thought finding out the truth would heal us," she said softly, tears pooling in her tired eyes. "But there's no healing from this. You don't move on, you just learn to live with it." 4 years, the Lewis family endured not knowing, living with questions that had no answers. Every holiday, every birthday, Debbie's absence was a ghost at the table. The revelation that someone they had trusted, a figure in their community, a man who smiled at them in church, waved from his porch, had been responsible all along was a wound that cut even deeper than the initial loss. Knox County, as collective memory. Knox County wasn't just a town, it was an ecosystem of relationships, routines, and unspoken histories. Debbie's case had shaped it for generations. Local shop owner Frank Delgado remembered the fear of 1981 as if it were yesterday. After Debbie vanished, everything changed. Parents didn't let their kids walk home from school anymore. Folks started locking their doors. It was like innocence got ripped right out of this town. The years stretched into decades. With no answers, the town began creating its own narratives. Some whispered about a serial predator drifting through Illinois' backroads. Others blamed outsiders, a reflection of the quiet suspicion rural towns often carry. A few believed Debbie had run away, fueling a cruel myth that she'd chosen to disappear. The truth turned out to be far more ordinary, and therefore, more horrifying. The danger had been right here the entire time. The power of persistence. What broke the case open wasn't luck, it was relentless human determination. Detective Alejandro Ramirez, who inherited the cold case nearly 40 years after the crime, described the emotional weight. "I had stacks of files, dead leads, faded photos, it felt impossible. But I kept thinking about her. Debbie. She was 23. She deserved better from all of us." The breakthrough came when a handwritten letter was discovered in a box of forgotten evidence, a clue missed during the initial investigation. That letter eventually led to the suspect, unraveling a web of lies carefully maintained for decades. "Cold cases teach you something," Ramirez said. "Time doesn't erase evidence, it just buries it. And sometimes, you need fresh eyes and better tools to dig it up." The human cost of justice delayed. Even as justice was finally served, Knox County's victory was bittersweet. Debbie's parents, Margaret and Henry Lewis, passed away years before the arrest, never knowing the truth. Her friends, now in their 60s, carried the guilt of wondering if they could have done something differently. And the suspect's family, neighbors everyone thought they knew, was left reeling from the devastating revelation. The trial's conclusion didn't tie the story into a neat bow. Instead, it underscored the raw complexity of real-life justice. "You don't get to celebrate," Marlene said in an interview after the verdict. "You just stop wondering. And that has to be enough." Lessons beyond Knox County. Debbie's case is not an isolated tragedy. Across the U.S., thousands of cold cases sit unresolved, tucked into evidence rooms and forgotten archives. According to the FBI's National Crime Information Center, over 250,000 cases of missing persons and unsolved homicides remain open. Advances in DNA technology, digital forensics, and cross-jurisdictional collaboration are solving more of these cases than ever before. But as Ramirez points out, for every Debbie Lewis, there are hundreds more families still waiting for answers. We owe it to them to keep digging. The case also sparked broader conversations in Knox County about how communities respond to tragedy. Neighbors now organize an annual vigil for the missing, honoring not just Debbie but all those whose stories remain unfinished. Debbie's legacy. At the trial's conclusion, Marlene stepped outside, clutching her sister's Polaroid. In the soft glow of the setting sun, she addressed the small crowd gathered on the courthouse lawn. For 44 years, Debbie's name was a question. Today, it's an answer. But I want you to remember her for who she was, not just what happened to her. She loved painting, she laughed too loud, she dreamed of seeing the ocean. That's what we hold on to. For the first time in decades, the Lewis family could speak about Debbie without feeling trapped in the moment she disappeared. The bigger picture. The solving of Debbie Lewis's case isn't just the end of one story, it's a reminder. A reminder that time doesn't diminish truth. A reminder that justice, though delayed, is worth pursuing. And a reminder that behind every headline is a human life, dreams cut short, families shattered, communities forever changed. As Knox County begins to move forward, Debbie's memory has been woven into its fabric, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a call to action. Her story urges law enforcement, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike to never stop asking questions, never stop digging, and never stop caring. Because somewhere, right now, another family is still waiting. Closing line. Justice came late, Ramirez said quietly, standing beneath the courthouse steps. But it came. And for Debbie, that has to mean something. The Lewis family finally had the closure they had been waiting for. After 44 years, the truth was out. Justice had arrived, late, yes, but undeniable. In Knox County, Illinois, life began to move on. The whispers that had haunted Debbie's name slowly faded. The shadows surrounding 1981 finally lifted. But just as one cold case closed, another was about to reopen. It was late November 2023 when Detective Laura Henson, the same investigator who had cracked Debbie's case, found herself at her desk long after dark. The office was quiet except for the hum of an old ceiling fan and the muffled static of a police scanner in the corner. Her inbox was overflowing, routine follow-ups, media requests, and congratulations from colleagues. But buried among them was one email that made her stop cold. The subject line read, "She wasn't the first." Henson hesitated, her finger hovering over the trackpad. Finally, she clicked. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, aged, and stained at the edges. It showed a young woman standing beside a gas station sign, smiling at the camera. Scrolled across the bottom in faded ink were 4 chilling words. "Find the others." Attached was a list, 6 names, all women, all vanished between 1977 and 1981. None had ever been found. Her breath caught. Could it be possible? Had Debbie Lewis's killer not acted alone? Or worse, had the wrong person been caught? She reached for her phone, dialing a number she hadn't called in years. Ramirez, a gruff voice answered on the other end. "Detective," she whispered, lowering her voice. "I think Debbie's case was just the beginning." Outside the Knox County Police Department, the night stretched endlessly. Somewhere in the distance, a lone freight train wailed, cutting through the silence. And miles away, in an abandoned farmhouse at the edge of town, someone was watching the news coverage of the Lewis case. The flicker of the television lit up a wall plastered with photographs, timelines, and maps. Debbie's smiling face stared back from the center. A gloved hand reached out, slowly pinning another photograph beside hers, this one of a different woman, missing since 1978. A voice, low and rasping, broke the silence. They're getting too close.